let's talk about why character introductions are so crucial to the success of your project. You could have spent the past 6 months of your life writing the best screenplay you've ever written. It could have these twists and turns, it could tug at all the heartstrings, it could do everything right, but if the audience doesn't care about your characters, none of it matters. We live in a time of infinite entertainment possibilities, and if you don't hook the audience within the first 10 or 15 minutes, they're just going to go about their day. So character likability is so crucial, and you can divide it up into two categories. The first one is kind of the big picture character likability, so that's the full 2-hour movie, 300-page novel. That is the character moving about throughout the story, how he grows, how he learns, his arc, how it relates to the plot, and how he interacts with other characters. So the overall character likability is important, but just as important is that character introduction. The first 10 or 15 minutes where we meet our character for the first time. And it's just like real life where you can't make a first impression twice. So today we're just going to talk about the character introduction, the quick interaction that's a microcosm for your entire character's essence. One thing about character introductions, it's a very similar skill set to like a poet or a songwriter, where you have just one sentence here, one sentence there, that even though they're quick and short, you want them to stand for a much bigger idea. And so you want to extrapolate who this character is through just one little small scene. So we're going to cover a few different techniques today, and honestly, the more you can use, the better. This isn't like a pick which one is right for you. This is basically all these ideas are good, and cram in as many of them as you possibly can when introducing your character. So the way I see character introductions is they really fall within 3 different categories. The first is what we don't know. The second is what we do know, and the third is what we wish we knew. So the first technique is using what we don't know. And what I mean by that is adding the element of intrigue or suspense to the scene. And so if we plant a question in the mind of our audience, if we associate our character with something unknown, whether that's a secret of theirs, whether that's something that will develop later in the plot or in their backstory, but posing a question about the character forces our audience to pay attention to that character because they want the answer. So we've created some tension there. So the audience is forced to pay attention and forced to learn about our character and get to know them as the film progresses. So planting a question in the mind of our audience is very important. So the first technique, using something we don't know, adding that question, is very simple, straightforward. The second technique is using something that we know. And what I mean by that is using something that the audience can relate to within the character. And this approach, this does get a little artsy and existential, so hang with me for a little bit. But if we try and think about universal things that people relate to, if we basically distill what it means to be human within like 1 or 2 sentences, what do we arrive at if we try and figure that out? And as a writer, this is something that people think about a lot. And for me, what I've kind of boiled it down to, the human experience, or whatever you want to call it. Again, a little artsy, a little existential, but it helps us create these things within our characters. So hang with me. But the idea of being human is this idea that you are going through something that is difficult, that you feel like no one else around you fully understands, and you feel that it's necessary to persevere for the people around you who love and care about you. So if I was to distill a scenario that every human would relate to in some respect, even successful people, even happy people, go through times where they feel like no one quite understands them. And, part of this is, psychology rooted into our adolescence, where we're kids and, we think our parents just don't understand, even though they went through everything we went through, albeit a little bit differently. And so that idea that we're going through something difficult and no one quite gets us, but we need to persevere, that is something that you can really find within any story, any successful story that's ever been told. And so I think that concept, we can begin to pick that apart a little bit and see what elements can the audience relate to and what elements can we use and put inside our characters. And so when the audience watches them, they see themselves within those characters. So working off that idea that you're going through something that no one quite understands, the first thing that we can take away from that is to make your character an underdog. If you make your character an underdog, everyone will immediately root for him or her. You think of famous underdogs throughout movie history. You have Frodo, who's a little hobbit who has to destroy the ring in a volcano miles and miles away past armies of bad guys. Frodo is a huge underdog. You think of 12 Angry Men. You have one juror who isn't quite sold on the idea that the kid's guilty, and then 11 jurors who are just ready to completely write him off as guilty. You have in Fargo, you have Marge, the pregnant cop, who she's going after the killers while she's pregnant. She's definitely an underdog in that story. And so the idea that you're going through something difficult and no one can relate to, you always feel like an underdog in that situation. Past arts, you think of sports. If you don't have a team in the fight, you're always going to be rooting for the little guy. You're going to be rooting for the underdog because it's a great story when the little guy wins. And so making your character an underdog is a great technique to get people to immediately like him or her. So the idea of being an underdog has a lot to do with genre, actually. If you pick a genre like horror, for instance, your character is immediately an underdog, right? Every horror movie, they're going up against a killer, a monster, a ghost, whatever. So the main characters in horror movies are always underdogs. Now, similar to making your character an underdog, going back to that idea of going through something difficult that no one quite understands, giving your character a past pain is a very good way to make the audience really root for them. And one thing about giving the character a past pain that's important to note is that it's very powerful in the big picture. We talked about the big picture character likability. You don't necessarily want to open up with a scene really showing off the character's past pain. You don't want to open up with a scene of the parents dying or the wife dying or anything like that, unless, if you're doing a hard drama, if the genre calls for it, then that is fine. But it is a little bit of, if you think about it, if someone on the street randomly comes up to you and says, "Hey, my dog died this week, I need a little bit of money, can you help me?" You're going to be like, "I'm sorry, I don't know you. I wish I could help, but I don't know you. I don't know if you're telling the truth. You don't want to say I don't care about you as a person, but you don't know the person, right?" Whereas if a good friend of yours came to you, your best friend came to you and was like, "Hey, my dog died, and I'm trying to raise a little bit of money for a doggy funeral or whatever," you would be like, "Oh, absolutely," and you would help them, and you would buy them a drink, and you want to talk to them, and you want to make sure that they're feeling good because they're your friend, and you know them, and you care about them. And it's the same thing with your characters in a movie. If you introduce this pain too early on and the audience doesn't know and appreciate your character yet, they're not going to be quite as invested. And so a great technique to introduce this past pain is going back to the idea of intrigue or mystery, is creating little question marks about this past pain that you later have to fill out. And so the character, maybe his parents aren't his biological parents. You see that he's raised by someone who's, 60 years older than him. And so you wonder what happened to his parents. And later on, we'll learn about that, right? If you see a character who wears a wedding ring, but the spouse is never around, you're implanting questions of, well, are they still alive? Are they still in the picture? Is there some tension there? And so adding question marks to this past pain, it's kind of twofold. It makes the audience care about them because of the pain, but also it adds the element of suspense that the audience is forced to pay attention and they want to learn and find out what happened in the past. And so this past pain, again, I don't recommend that you open up with something super dramatic unless that's the tone you're going for, but implanting questions about the past pain, it also gives you a nice reveal scene down the line as well. So our character could be an underdog. He could have some sort of past pain. What else goes along with that idea of going through something difficult that no one quite understands? And a good approach is a fish out of water story. And so our main character is in a world that they don't belong in. It very much ties in with the underdog idea, but it is a specific type of story. And this idea, it does usually have a lot more to do with the big picture idea. When you think, Wizard of Oz, Dorothy did not start in Oz, she started in Kansas. So once she got to the world where things were flipped upside down, we all understood and it made sense to us. And so usually fish out of water stories are a bit more on the big picture character likability. But if we pick certain situations that we intrinsically understand are fish out of water stories. An 18-year-old kid in the military who's super nervous, we understand that he just got drafted, he signed up, he didn't want to, whatever. We understand that he's in a place that he's unfamiliar with, that he doesn't really want to be there. Someone starts a new job, a kid moves to a new town. So these type of events, if we start off with, we understand that it's a fish out of water story, because typically in a movie, in a story, the first 10 minutes, the first 15 minutes, the world is in stasis. We're seeing the character in their everyday life before the inciting incident when everything flips upside down. And so introducing the character in that stasis is a very common traditional technique. And so to use this fish out of water idea when it comes to character introductions, it usually has to be coupled with, again, those scenarios that we immediately understand is a fish out of water scenario. So going back to that big umbrella of things that we know, using something that we can relate to within our character. And this one is a little bit more for classical stories of like a tragic hero. But if our hero has a flaw, whatever journey, whatever arc that they're going to go through, if it's based on a flaw, we want to make sure that we introduce that flaw as empathetic. And so when we think of Finding Nemo, Nemo's dad is overprotective about his son, and that is his flaw. But we can see that the wife is not in the picture, and so we're very empathetic to why he is overprotective. The protagonist of Fight Club is this dull worker drone who's just going through life without questioning anything. And we relate to that because it's comfortable, it's easy. We empathize with that. Yeah, we've been there. We've had that 9 to 5, and time has just slipped by, right? So introducing these flaws as empathetic flaws, again, allows us to connect with that character and relate to that character. And if we possess some sort of element of that flaw on our own, we're definitely rooting for that character, because if they conquer the flaw, then in some weird way, we feel like we're closer to conquering that flaw. So I would say the last technique in the big umbrella of using what we know is if our character is a champion of the downtrodden. And what that phrase basically means is if we see a scene with our character petting a dog, or saving a cat from a tree, or giving the homeless some money, or walking an old lady across the street, if we see this very classical idea of, oh, that's a good person, we are relating to that character on some level. Now, this is a little bit more of an old school thought. In the past 20 or 30 years, we've been much more open to our main characters being bad guys and rooting for the bad guy. And so this has been diluted a little bit, and it is a little bit of a cop-out just to have, the character's good with pets, so I guess we're rooting for them. But it may be a cop-out, but it's effective. So it's an effective way of just having a little bit of, they must be a good person in there. So that is kind of the last technique of the what we know approach. So we've talked about things we don't know. We've talked about things we do know. Let's talk about things we wish we knew. And what I mean by that is, instead of adding elements to your character that you relate to directly, a lot of times we want our character to be a better version of ourselves. We want our character to be someone we aspire to be. Because if the character was just someone we completely related to and basically knew on a personal level, the movie would not be super interesting. Movie characters are super smart sometimes. They're super funny sometimes. And that's because a whole team of people have been working on this script for months. And so it's always something that we want to see in our characters, is having them be a better version of who we are. So most likely my favorite one of these is the idea of being resourceful. A resourceful character is someone that we automatically latch onto, because the concept and the ability of being resourceful is a bit of like cleverness plus wit, plus intrigue. Like there's so many elements mashed together in a resourceful character. I think of Ferris Bueller is incredibly resourceful. He builds the whole mannequin thing in his bed that when the mom opens the door, it like rolls over and it moves and it's tied to the snoring. He goes in the fancy restaurant and sees the guest list and pretends he's Abe Froman. Ferris Bueller is so resourceful and clever. He's so much fun to watch because it's kind of like that question thing of he's so smart and clever in this situation. How is he going to get out of the next situation? How is he going to top himself? What's he going to do now? So it does add that question mark that we talked about. We think of the movie Memento. The main character has tattooed himself with the clues to the mystery he's trying to solve. That's incredibly smart that we wouldn't have thought of on our own. It would take a whole team of writers months to create something like that. You know, Indiana Jones has the whole bag of sand that he replaces the artifact with. He also brings a gun to a knife fight. Indiana Jones is resourceful. Again, his is kind of comedic. And so because he's funny and resourceful, we like that and we want to watch that. So that kind of brings me to my next point of what we wish we knew, and that is make your characters funny. It is always a good time to watch a funny character. If the audience is laughing, they're interested and they're going to want to continue watching. So unless you're making a super hard-hitting drama with not a lot of levity, even though you should have scenes of that, make your characters funny, because if the audience is laughing, they're having a good time. And especially when it comes to characters who are very flawed, when it comes to anti-heroes. If Deadpool was not funny, we would turn it off within 10 minutes because it would be very difficult to watch. So humor is kind of this magic bullet of character likability. You want to keep the character within the tone of the movie, but honestly, it's never bad to have jokes. Okay, so what we wish we knew. And this one is very nebulous and hard to pin down, and it is a sign of a great writer, and this is something that people constantly forget to have with their characters, but just the cool factor, the it factor, the something unique and interesting factor about the character. And whether this is actually like a cool factor like a Han Solo or Tyler Durden or Baby Driver or something like that, it can be an actual cool factor, or it can be like a quirky, interesting, something is unique about this character factor. So you think of Napoleon Dynamite or the dude from Big Lebowski or even Joker. These characters are off in a way that is intriguing and makes us want to continue to watch these characters. So this one is the most difficult to actually articulate because it's impossible to say, oh, this character has it, this character does not have it. It's just, giving them something unique about them, the way they talk, the way they hold themselves, giving your character the cool factor. I don't know how to describe it, but thinking about that is definitely important, because if you don't even consider that idea, you end up writing very typical traditional characters that we've seen 1,000 times. So these characters that are super cool and interesting, they're very similar to what we've seen before, but just 10% their own thing. So always think about that when crafting your characters. Leaning more into what we wish we knew. Sometimes it's interesting to have our character be an introduction into a world that we haven't seen before. So when we think of those mob movies from the 60s and 70s, Scorsese movies, that was a look into a world that we hadn't seen in cinema before, and so that's why it was so appealing at some point. But now we're so accustomed to those types of movies. We're accustomed to ER TV shows, and so trying to have our characters introduce us to a world that we really know nothing about, it is getting more difficult, but when you can achieve that, again, people are curious, so they want to learn about things things they don't know. So if the character is a way into a world that's new to us, we want to continue watching, we want to continue learning about that world. So you think of TV shows like Pawn Stars or Ice Road Truckers. These are worlds that we knew nothing about before those shows. Jurassic Park introduced us to the world of paleontology. Nightcrawler introduced us to the world of making money off filming for tragic news stories. So if a character can really pull the veil back and allow us to see into a world we haven't seen before, it's always a great angle. Another thing we wish we knew is the idea of a self-aware character, a character who knows their flaws and is able to address them and overcome them, whether they're doing this in a dramatic way or a comedic way, a self-deprecating way. Knowing your flaws is something that we all wish we had a better grasp on, because if we had that ability, we would address the flaws and get rid of them, right? So a self-aware character is always pretty good too. So another thing we wish we knew is having to do with a character with lofty yet attainable goals, noble goals that make us really want the good guy to win at the end of the day. And we want these goals to be attainable goals and tangible goals because we wish the world worked like that. We wish it was very easy to see our goals, envision our goals, and then achieve our goals. And so when we see a character with that ability, we want to root for them. And lastly, the element we wish we knew, and this is probably the most important one of these, something that shows up in every great story, and that is the quality of resilience. Going back to that idea that we're going through something difficult and we need to persevere for the people around us. The idea of resilience is something that we always root for. We know life is difficult, and we know there are certain things that we just want to give up on. But we know that if someone can fight through the pain and achieve the goal, that really is such a human thing that we can all connect with. And so the idea of resilience, again, the character basically always has to win at the end, right? Unless you're doing some art movie that is not, the traditional Western storytelling. The character, we want them to triumph at the end because we want to feel good, like we helped, even though we just watched, we want to feel like we succeeded in some way. And so the idea of resilience is so important. So that's pretty much it. That is my toolkit of how to make characters likable. Again, like I said before, this isn't quite a pick and choose what works for you. This is a take as many as you can and cram them all into one character in the quickest way possible, because the more of these that you're able to check off, the more the audience will like your character. And again, in a world of competing entertainment, you have 5 to 10 minutes to really capture the imagination of your audience. So use these tools, put them in your characters, and I know you guys are going to come up with something great.